Hi guys, it's Crystal. I hope you guys all had a really great holiday and that you're having a good rest of the week. I know it's almost the new year. I know a lot of us are looking forward to it. Maybe some more than others. I know this Christmas season was hard on a lot of people, but hopefully next year at some point in time, things will ease up a little bit. So I hope you guys are all being safe. I hope you guys are all happy, and I hope you guys celebrated the best way you possibly could. Um, Today's video is going to be a little bit different because I did want to go back and do something historical and hopefully something shorter. Sorry guys, I know you guys are busy right now. I'm busy right now. My kids are home, so from time to time you may hear a noise. They are on their electronic devices, but that is part of the noise that you guys have been hearing every once in a while. So like I said, today's video is going to be a historical one, and it's a really interesting case. It's something that I remember from some of my law classes. You guys may remember it too, because there's a lot of historical value in this case. It was the first execution for a lot of parts of Canada. So we're really going back in time right now, guys. As for my last video, I hope you guys watched it and enjoyed it. And for all my other videos, if you are new to this channel, I hope you guys will like, and that you'll subscribe, hit the notification bell, and hopefully you guys will leave me some comments and we can talk about crime. This video is for educational or entertainment purposes only. And if you guys do choose to leave a comment, please, no hate. There's enough hate in the world already. So let's just leave comments and have discussions. And if you are a returning subscriber, thank you guys. I just want to say I've only been doing this for a couple months now, but I'm really, really grateful to everybody that subscribed, and you guys have made this worthwhile for me. This has been a dream of mine for a while, so thank you guys. So, like I said, getting into it. This is very much a historical case. And like I said, you guys may know who we're talking about. I will have to refer to my notes from time to time, guys. You know, sometimes it's hard for me to memorize everything. So, in the winter of 1939, a man named Kaki Si Kuchin was born. He was born to a Cree tribe. They assume it was in the winter of 1939 because, remember, records back then, it was harder to establish certain things. So Kaki Si Kuchin is actually Swift Runner in English, and that's what we're going to be calling him, Swift Runner. So he was born, they think, around the winter of 1939 to a Cree tribe. He was actually born in the Canadian Northwest Territories. So at that time, this particular location he was born in would become Alberta later on, but for these purposes, it's the Canadian Northwest Territories. And he had a really solid Cree education. He was a very tall man. He was about 6'3". His face was described as not exceptionally good looking, but he was a very strong man. He was a gifted and respected hunter and trapper for the Cree First Nation. He was also exceedingly nice, from what I've heard people say. He was very charming. He was trustworthy. He was soft-spoken and mild. He was a quiet man. And for all intents and purposes, for the first portion of his life, he was very well regarded, both within the Cree First Nation and within the Canadian Northwest Territories, particularly Fort Saskatchewan, which we're going to get into. Because he was such a well-known hunter and trapper, he actually traded furs with the Hudson's Bay Company. So you guys know Hudson's Bay Company is a really exceedingly old company. It was started sometime in the 1600s. I think it was 1661. So at the time we're talking about, this particular time in the late 1800s, it was still a fur trading company. You would trade furs for supplies and supplies for furs, so on and so forth. And this is one of the places where Swift Runner actually worked. Well, traded, I guess. he didn't really work for them. Now the Hudson's Bay Company had their own rules around things, which we'll get into too. He also was hired on in about 1875 as a guide for the Northwest Mounted Police. Now the Northwest Mounted Police are technically today's Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP. They're a precursor to it, but we're going to be referring to them as the Northwest Mounted Police. He started working as a guide for them, like I said, in 1875. And at this particular point in time, the Northwest Mounted Police had only been in existence for about 2 years. They started in 1873. So the area that he lived in and the closest settlements would be Fort Saskatchewan. Now, Fort Saskatchewan, despite what it's called, is actually not in Saskatchewan. It's along the Saskatchewan River and is about 25 kilometers away from Edmonton. So it is in Alberta. And it was originally started as a Northwest Mounted Police fort, so they could watch over everything. And it later turned into a really large provincial prison. It's still in existence today, albeit not at the same site it was. It's only moved a little bit over. The replica fort was actually built in 2011, and that's the one that you can go and visit now. It's very close to the original site. I think it's right beside it, actually. And the people today even still pride themselves on their history of law and order. So Fort Saskatchewan, very much law and order. But at this particular time, it was an it was a Northwest Mounted Police fort. So there is an article at this point in time, a news story that said that Swift Runner himself was actually ruined by the white man. If you recall, in the 1870s, we had a lot of European settlers come over, and the European settlers didn't necessarily want to share Canada with the natives. So they basically went out and killed the food source for a lot of the First Nations, the Cree First Nation for sure, which was the buffalo. They would just go out and shoot hundreds upon hundreds and upon hundreds of the buffalo. I don't think the white settlers used the meat, but they did it in an attempt to push the natives from the natives' own land, so then the Europeans could there take it over. So the 1870s were a really hard time for the Cree Nation, as well as many other tribes, because the buffalo had been so plentiful before, and now food was becoming scarce. So it was a time of hardship, it was a time of misery, and it was a time of starvation for the Cree people. Swift Runner and his family, obviously being part of this as well, we're having a harder time finding food. Now, another part of the destruction is the fact that the white man introduced the native tribes to alcohol, specifically whiskey, and they touted this whiskey as medicine. Of course, as we know, a lot of people then became addicted to it, and Swift Runner was no exception. He became addicted to alcohol, and he became an alcoholic. And this actually heavily changed his personality. From being such a quiet, nice, mild-mannered man who reports say was very considerate of his wife and was very fond of his children. He had 6 children with his wife. He was married when he was younger to this particular woman, and together in their marriage, they had 6 children. And it changed him into a mean and violent drunk. So much so that some people reported him as being the terror of the region. I'm going to quote that, when he was drunk. Eventually, Fort Saskatchewan kicked him out. They had had enough of his drunken antics and his violence, so they kicked him out, and he returned to his tribe. He caused a lot of trouble and a lot of problems for his Cree tribe, because he made life, and I'm quoting this again, an absolute hell for them. His drunken antics and his violence were so detrimental to the tribe. They also actually kicked him out. They didn't want anything more to do with him. So during the winter, the RCMP, I'm going to keep saying the RCMP. I'm really sorry, guys. I mean the Northwest Mounted Police. The Northwest Mounted Police actually fired him at around this time too, because he was no longer the trustworthy man that he had been. The Northwest Mounted Police had actually hired him because they'd heard about how trustworthy he was, but his skills were deteriorating very fast. His hunting skills and his trapping skills had all deteriorated, in part to the fact because of the death of so many buffalo, but also a large part was due to the fact that he was drunk all the time. So in the winter of 1878 and 1879, you guys know what I mean when I'm saying that, one year crossing over to another. He actually took his family, which would be his wife, his 6 children, his brother, and from what I've heard, his mother-in-law. Some sources say it was his mother, but I tend to believe it was more his mother-in-law. And this is actually from the history of Fort Saskatchewan. He took them out into the woods, further out into the woods, and set up a camp there. It was very isolated, and it was a hard winter. The winter of 1878 to 79 was very hard on the Cree people, and it would be no exception for this family living out in isolation. They didn't have their community around them anymore because he had essentially been removed. Sometime in the spring of 1879, stories started to trickle in to Fort Saskatchewan. One was from a Cree chief who said that Swift Runner had turned cannibal. Another was from a hunter who said that all of Swift Runner's family was dead. The Northwest Mounted Police actually went out to try to locate the camp or the family, and they couldn't find either. This would be in the early spring. So stories were trickling back. Now, this is where the articles diverge. I checked multiple sources for this. One set of sources said that when Swift Runner emerged in the spring of 1879, he went to the Northwest Mounted Police and told them that his wife had committed suicide and that the rest of his family had died from starvation. This was kind of suspicious to the Northwest Mounted Police because Swift Runner himself didn't look like he was in poor condition, didn't look like he was starving. He looked pretty fit, so it didn't make a lot of sense to them that so many of his family members were dead from starvation. It should also be known that about 40 kilometers away from where they set up camp was an emergency supply from the Northwest food supply, from the Hudson's Bay Company. So Swift Runner could have actually gone there. I mean, walking 40 kilometers at that point in time was not a big deal. He could have actually gone there and gotten some food, but he didn't do that. So it was also really troublesome, the fact that he was so close to food sources but refused to get them, and yet said his family had starved. The other source, which I tend to believe because once again it came from the history of Fort Saskatchewan and several other articles, was that when Swift Runner emerged, he went to the St. Albert Roman Catholic Mission, and he stayed there for a time, and he told them that his family had all died from starvation. One of the fathers there, or one of the priests there, Father Leduc, took a look at him and he's like, wow, this doesn't seem right because he's so fit and he doesn't look like he's in poor condition. How could his family be dead from starvation? So they say that it was Father Leduc that went to the Northwest Mounted Police and told them. Regardless, the stories reconverge that a man named Inspector Sévère Gagnon and a small party of Northwest Mounted Police officers and Swift Runner went to his camp. Now, some sources say that Swift Runner immediately took them to camp. Some sources say that he kind of tried to lead them in other directions, and he would only take them to the camp if they gave him whiskey and he was drunk. Regardless, they did end up at this camp. Now, Swift Runner, excuse me for 1 second, guys. Himself at this time did show them a grave, and the grave was undisturbed. The bones inside were not disturbed, and said that it was his eldest son. And there is evidence that his eldest son did actually die of natural causes. He just died. So officers were a little bit obliging until they actually went into the whole camp, and it was a horrific scene. There were bones scattered everywhere. There was a pot of human fat sitting near a cook fire. And the bones, some of them had been broken in half and were completely hollowed out, like someone or something had sucked the marrow actually out of them. Northwest Mounted Police officers showed him a skull, and he was able to identify it as his wife. And with a little further prodding, he told the tale of what had happened to his family. Swift Runner did admit to murdering his whole entire family, cooking them, and eating them. He also claimed that his mother-in-law was a bit tough. Now, here's where the story takes an unusual turn. Swift Runner himself said that he himself did not do this, but he was possessed by a spirit called the Wendigo. Some places call it the Wendigo, some places call it the Wendigo. You will hear me probably intermix both terms because I know both terms. Swift Runner claims that the spirit of the Wendigo actually started in his dreams. He started dreaming about this thing, and they were horrific nightmares, and it was calling to him, telling him to kill and eat those around him. Eventually, the Wendigo infested him body and mind, and he became the Wendigo. He was no longer Swift Runner, he was the Wendigo. So as the Wendigo, he killed his wife and ate her. Now, there are various stories about how he killed his family. Some of them say he bludgeoned them with axes. Some of them say he suffocated them. Some of them say he strangled them. Some say they were beaten. Some say they were shot, or like a combination of them. So we don't really know for sure how he killed his family, just because all that was left was bones. You couldn't see the flesh or anything, so you couldn't see entrance and exit marks. He then forced one of his older kids to kill a younger brother and cut him up and then eat him. Now, I'm not sure if the rest of the family members partook in eating each other. All I know is that he did force one of his older children to do this as the Wendigo. As the Wendigo, he hung up his infant child from a lodge pole by its neck, and then would pull on its feet until it died, and it too was cooked and eaten. So were the rest of the children, so was the mother-in-law, and so was his brother. Eventually he did away with all of them. Now, what's interesting to note is that the Wendigo was very much a part of the Algonquin First Nation, the Algonquin-speaking First Nations. The Cree are part of the Algonquin-speaking First Nations, as well as the Algonquins, the Ojibwa, the Innu, and the Naskapi. They're all part of the Algonquin First Nations. So you're going to hear me using both terms, Cree and Algonquin First Nations. This is very much a part of their culture. The Wendigo was basically a tale discouraging people from partaking in such a taboo thing. Even during times of starvation and famine, you were not supposed to eat each other. You were either supposed to commit suicide or starve yourself. It was never, ever, ever appropriate to eat another person. It was very frowned upon. It was not something that was accepted within the culture. The Wendigo has been described, and I'm going to quote this directly. So just give me 1 second, guys. Okay, in Cree mythology, if the Wendigo possesses you, it will turn your heart to ice and cause you to hunger after human flesh. And another direct quote, this is from a dictionary. The Wendigo, quote, is a spirit believed by the Algonquins, Crees, Ojibwas, and various other tribes to take possession of a vulnerable person, causing them to engage in cannibalism and other forms of antisocial behavior. So this was not a rare occurrence either. Within the tribes, this occurred often enough. And the people had the same similar characteristics as what happened to Swift Runner. They had these grandiose ideas. They were involved in cannibalism. They were violent. They were mean. And they all ended up dying in very horrible ways. So Swift Runner very much believed that this had happened to him. Now, there are a few characteristics that the tribes share with regards to the Wendigo, because certain tribes have different meanings for the Wendigo. But these entities are malevolent, powerful, supernatural beings. They're cannibalistic, and they have great spiritual power. They are almost always associated with winter, coldness, the north, starvation, and famine. Usually in the lore, a Wendigo would come out during times of starvation and famine, and we know in the 1870s the Cree people were having a very hard time finding food, so it makes sense that so many tribesmen were showing attributes of this. Though it can appear human in nature, the Wendigo is often described as someone with too tight looking skin, sunken in eyes, their lips are all ravaged, they smell of decay, they're very emaciated, and they're never full. They do not stop at one kill. They will continue to kill and eat, kill and eat, kill and eat, because they are never full. Some of the Algonquin tribes have described that the Wendigo is actually a giant, and it grows. And what's interesting to note is that Swift Runner was 6'3". At this point in time, in the 1870s for sure, I mean, he's still considered really tall now, but in the 1870s for sure, he would have been seen as very tall. So the Wendigo is described in some cultures as a giant and it grows in proportion to what it eats, and that's why it's never full. It represents excess, it represents greed, and it represents selfishness. So like I said, the Algonquin tribes definitely did not think this was something you were ever supposed to do. You should never eat another human being. I mean, it's not just the Algonquin tribes that believe this. This is what humanity knows. You are never supposed to eat another human being, even during times of starvation and famine. But the Cree took it one step further, saying, like, you can't do it. You should commit suicide or you should starve to death. You should never, ever do this. And there were Wendigo ceremonies performed. These ceremonies included putting on a mask and dancing backwards to the beat of a drum around a fire. And they were specifically to deter people, number one, from eating each other. But number two, from excess, deter people from excess, from greed, from selfishness, and to remind people that they were part of a community, that the community was behind you. But in Swift Runner's case, we know the community wasn't. He had been expelled from the community. So I guess he was probably feeling at this time very lonely and betrayed. And let's not forget the fact that he was drinking a lot too, and he had these delusions of grandiosity. So he was arrested actually in May of 1879, May 27th of 1879. Now, I do want people to know that what Swift Runner was likely suffering from was something called Wendigo psychosis. This is an actual anthropological and psychological term. Basically, what it means is you have such illusions of grandeur, you hunger after human flesh, you partake in these antisocial behaviors, and this is a mental disorder. Because it was found in so many different tribes people, this is a mental disorder. It was discovered and firmly diagnosed in the early 1900s. It is a hotly debated term. Some psychologists believe in it, others don't. And it's not used now, basically. It went into decline as soon as people started living in cities and towns, when there were more people around. People were not so isolated. So you don't see this term being used now, although we're all in quarantine, so who knows. But this term is not used right now, and it is hotly debated. But basically, I'm just going to read you the direct quote that I got, guys. Just give me 1 second, sorry. Its characteristics are described as having delusions of grandiosity and cannibalistic impulses. Anthropologists have identified it in several of the Algonquin-speaking cultures, like the Algonquin, the Cree, and the Ojibwa. And it was a frequent enough occurrence within certain tribes that several other people had similar symptoms. This psychosis typically affected people in the winter, when there were times of limited sunlight, when you were isolated because of the snow, and when you didn't partake in the rituals of your community, right? They had a lot of rituals in the summertime, not so many in the winter. And it was when you were basically forced to only see, I know this sounds really bad for our times right now, you were only forced to see your family. So it basically, this mental disorder would come out. And it could have been a combination of things too. If you'll remember, Swift Runner could have had this mental illness, but he also was drinking a lot. So that probably didn't help. There was a great deal of interplay between them. So I do want people to know, though, that Wendigo psychosis is something that is a real diagnosis. And they do not perform Wendigo ceremonies anymore. The last one, I had a really hard time finding the date. I couldn't actually find the date. I would believe it was in the late 20th century, but the last dance was actually performed in the United States. So the Algonquin speaking First Nations actually are found in Nova Scotia, Quebec, Ontario, Alberta, parts of the United States, as long as they're around the Great Lakes region, also have the Algonquin tribes within them. When they consolidated, guys, remember when a lot of the tribes consolidated, they became the Algonquin First Nation. So that's why I refer to them as that. So once again, Swift River was arrested in May 27th of 1879, and they took him to Fort Saskatchewan and put him on trial. This trial started August 8th, and it did include a jury of people that spoke Cree and understood Cree. I think some of the people that were on the jury were actually part Cree themselves, so they could understand what Swift Runner was saying, and they would be more knowledgeable about the Algonquin tribes. An interpreter was also provided to Swift Runner so that he could understand the trial itself. When Swift Runner was asked, because he did acknowledge his guilt, when he was asked what he wanted to say in his own defense, he said, and I quote, "I did it," end quote. Swift Runner was described by the officers that watched over him at the fort as a charming man. He was so likable that most of them ended up really liking him. And they kind of felt bad that he would have to die. But a magistrate, and I think his last name was Richardson, Magistrate Richardson, I could be wrong. He was a magistrate anyway, a judge, did obviously condemn him. He was guilty. The jury found him guilty as well, and he was sentenced to death. But while he was at the fort, he didn't have alcohol like he would have before. So this could have been a reason why his personality, his actual personality, his charmingness, his quietness, his well-manneredness, the fact that he was so well-liked, this could be a reason why it was coming back out, because he was completely dry at this point in time. So the hanging itself was scheduled for December 20th of 1879, and it was supposed to take place at 7:30 in the morning. Now this time was bitterly, bitterly cold, and the spectators, there were 60 spectators to this, actually had taken apart part of the gallows to make themselves little fires because it was so cold, so they had to rebuild them. Swift Runner himself at this point in time was basically just talking and laughing with the officers around a fire, eating pemmican, but he had the noose still around his neck, and he did actually offer to kill himself with a tomahawk so that he could spare everybody the trouble of having to do so. The actual hanging took place at around 9:30, and this is where the story gets difficult again, because some sources say that Swift Runner became Roman Catholic before he died. Other sources say that when a priest was invited to see him the night before his execution, he said something along the lines of, the white man ruined me. I don't believe that their God could help me out in any way, or I don't make very much of their God. So I don't know if that's true. But sources reconverge and say that Swift Runner acknowledged his guilt. He thanked his jailers for their kindnesses, and he actually berated his guard for making him wait out in the cold so long. When he went to his death, he's quoted as saying, "I am no longer a man," end quote. And then he fell down the gallows. Obviously, he was hung. It only took about an hour, and then they cut him down and buried his body. So Swift Runner's execution was the first for the Northwest Mounted Police. The Hudson's Bay Company, like I said, they kind of dealt with their own justice. So the Hudson's Bay Company had executed one of their employees at this point in time because he had been a murderer, so they did hang him. But the Northwest Mounted Police had never done this before. They were kind of shying away from it, so they actually hired a man. He was an Army pensioner. His name was Rogers. They paid him $50 to be the hangman. So this is the first execution at Fort Saskatchewan, the first in Western Canada, the first in Alberta. It's also the first for the Northwest Mounted Police. So Swift Runners was actually the first execution by a Canadian police force as well, that I know of anyway. His story, though, is very interesting. You have to ask yourself what really happened to his family. Number one, we're not certain what actually did occur with his family. We only have what he says. We don't know how long it took. We don't know if he forced any of his other family members to do this. But I would like to point out that several sources claimed that sometime earlier, before he was expelled from the community in Fort Saskatchewan, he and another fellow hunter got lost in the woods. And it was during the winter when they were out hunting for food. And so much to the extent that they were lost that his partner starved to death, and that Swift Runner allegedly ate the partner as well. So he had already partaken in eating human flesh. Now, like I said, there are 3 ways. Oh, I may not have said it, but there are 3 ways that a Wendigo can become you. Number 1, you're possessed, which is what seems like what happened to Swift Runner. Number 2, if you are around a Wendigo too long, you can become one yourself. And number 3, if you eat human flesh, if you involve in pure cannibalism is actually when you're forced to eat somebody else due to starvation and famine. Whereas other forms of cannibalism would be you wanting to eat flesh because you felt like it. So there's the 2 distinct possibilities for why he could have become a Wendigo, because he had already eaten human meat. He had already eaten during the time of starvation when he was not supposed to. He had already eaten a human being, or he had become possessed by it. He could have had these nightmares for years before. We don't really know, and I'm sure drinking didn't actually help. So here are the questions that I have to pose forth in regards to Swift Runner, what happened, the Wendigo, and everything else. What made him do it? Was it really a Wendigo that possessed him from him having to eat flesh before? Or did he somehow become the Wendigo because of this? Despite his tribe's negative viewpoints on it, Why did he partake in eating human flesh? What made him do this? They were close to a food source, guys. So why did he choose to do that? Now, number one, it was more than likely because he was suffering from Wendigo psychosis, very much so. And he was under the influence of drinking, which didn't help either. It gives you hallucinations and delusions as well. So there could have been that. Was this due to his alcoholism, like I said? He was a mean and violent person when he was drunk. I don't know if he partook in any other murders before this, other than the partner, which we can't technically say was a murder because he had already starved to death. Did he kill them and eat them, though, because the drink had affected his brain so much? We know that drinking can cause people to act in very different ways than they would and do different things than they would. I'm not saying that this is in any way a defense for anything that happened. I'm just saying we know that drinking can cause you to become a different person. Did this happen to Swift-Runner? Did he change so much because of the drinking? And then you add in isolation, you add in winter, you add in snow, you add in only seeing the same people over and over again. Did that make him do this? How did he get alcohol when he was out in the forest? Did he have any other contact with people? We know that there was a Cree chief that spoke out and another hunter, so maybe they had just passed by the camp. I would like to know how he did get the alcohol out there, because he had been kicked out of Fort Saskatchewan, so he wasn't supposed to be there. I'm just wondering. Did he have Wendigo psychosis? Do you guys believe that he had Wendigo psychosis? Was he suffering from a different mental disorder? Was it just the drinking, or was he a psychopath? Had he always been prone to murder? If you'll remember, charming, likable, trustworthy, these easily able to make friends. These are all characteristics of psychopathy and regular life too, but they are characteristics of it. And showing a mean and violent side. Is it possible that he was a psychopath? Was he a cannibal by choice? Did he actually partake in eating these people just because he wanted to, including the former partner? Maybe he already had a taste for flesh. I mean, we've heard about it with people like Jeffrey Dahmer, who ate people, and Albert Fish. They seem to enjoy it. Maybe he already had a taste for it because of his previous victim. Could this have been due to his hatred of the white man? I know that he did not kill white people. He killed his own tribe members. But could it be because he felt so much hatred, so much anger and frustration at the fact that his food source was gone, so much anger because he was so addicted to drinking he couldn't stop, and it was because of the white person? Did he feel anger because he was being displaced? He was being pushed out of his own land, and it caused him to lash out like this? Could that have been a part of his personality challenge? We know that white settlers definitely changed the ways of Native American life. They were forced into residential schools. They were forced to assimilate into a culture that was not theirs. They were destroyed. The people were destroyed. This is part of Canadian history. You guys can look it up if you choose to. We know that the white man did a lot of terrible things to the Native people. And a lot of it was because they just wanted the land. They figured, hey, the land is ours. It doesn't matter if you were here first, it's ours now. We're saying it's ours. So could this have been his way of fighting back? It's debatable. I don't know. Were these changes destined to happen to him anyway? Because of a combination of several forces: hatred of the white man, mental illness, isolation, drinking. Was what happened a combination of forces because of this? No one can really say for sure what actually happened out there, mostly because what we have now is second and third hand information. We weren't actually there at that point in time. Was he always going to be a murderer anyway? That's the last and final thought? Was he always just set up to be a murderer? Was this going to happen anyway, regardless of whether he had eaten flesh before, regardless of mental illness? Was he always going to be a murderer? And what do you guys think? I do tend to believe that this is a possibility. I am not going to discount somebody else's beliefs. I know it may have seemed like in my last video I did about Bigfoot. I just laughed like that because some of the forums that I visited, they had some very specific stories, and like I said, all I could picture was Rudolph and the friggin' Bumble, because my kids had just watched it. But I don't discount that. If somebody believes in something, usually lore and mythology has a grain of truth to it. Perhaps a Wendigo doesn't look like what we think it does, but maybe this was a term, first of all, for Wendigo psychosis, but also for somebody doing something that is so frowned upon, something that the rest of us would absolutely not do and would abhor. We know that people have done this for generations. Anybody has done this. Elizabeth Bathory in the 1600s liked to drink blood and bathe in people's blood and rip off pieces of flesh. So maybe they all had a form of psychosis like this. Maybe it was the spirit of the Wendigo. I would like to hear you guys' thoughts. What do you think happened to Swift Runner? What do you think happened to his family out there? Do you think they all had to take part in this before he killed them off one by one? Do you think that it was part of the drinking? Do you think it was the Wendigo? What do you guys think about this case? It's so interesting. And like I said, it was basically the first execution in Western Canada for sure, and by the Northwest Mounted Police, and in Fort Saskatchewan. So I would like to know everybody's thoughts on this. That's where we're going to leave it today. I hope you guys have a very safe and happy new year. And, you know, you get out the noise blowers or whatever with your own family. I'm sure we'll be doing that too. I hope that you guys will continue to watch. I hope that if you guys already haven't, that you'll like and subscribe and hit the notification bells. Share if you want. Leave me comments. I love to talk about this stuff. It's very interesting to me. And I try to share as much as what I can find out with you guys. And I'd like to thank you again for being with me during this year. In the new year, we have a lot of cases to cover, of course. There's going to be a few that seem American, but they do have, or English, that do have Canadian links. So hopefully you guys will come back and join me next week, and we'll delve into something even more interesting, if it could be possible. This was a really interesting case. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next week. Bye.